So you've heard some strong words from politicians on this, but what can Canada really do?
A new report shows a concerning trend in the Canadian agriculture sector. More than 40% of farm operators here in Canada are estimated to retire within the next decade. So what does the future of farming look like in this country?
For decades, Canada sat on one of the strongest agricultural positions in the world, yet behaved like a country with limited choices. Prairie farmers grew some of the best wheat on the planet. Alberta fields produced endless canola. Saskatchewan pulled more potash from the ground than any country on Earth. Still, when it came time to sell that power globally, Canada sent it south first. American railways moved the crops. American ports handled the exports. American companies controlled access and pricing. It became so normal that few questioned it. Then, in March 2025, Mark Carney did something unusual. Standing in front of Saskatchewan farmers, he asked a simple question that exposed a decades-old weakness. Why was Canada paying foreign tolls to ship its own food? The question hit harder because of the timing. Donald Trump was openly threatening new tariffs on Canadian agriculture. Grain faced a proposed 25% levy. Fertilizer faced new fees. These were not abstract trade disputes. They were direct threats to prairie livelihoods. What had once been accepted as an inconvenience suddenly looked like a risk Canada could not afford. Carney did not describe it as a crisis. He treated it like a logistics problem hiding in plain sight. Canada already dominates global potash markets. It ranks among the world's top wheat exporters, and it owns a deep-water Arctic port that cuts thousands of kilometers off shipping routes to Europe. That port, Churchill, had been ignored for decades. Suddenly, it looked like leverage. What followed was not symbolic or political theater. It was structural change. Canada began reshaping how a $780 billion agricultural trade system moves across the world. Fertilizer companies started rerouting supply chains. American logistics firms quietly lost control over routes they had dominated for generations. An Arctic port many had written off became relevant again. The shift happened quickly because the power was already there. Canada simply decided to use it. Canada's role in global food security has always been larger than most people realize. Across the prairies, wheat fields stretch to the horizon. Canola fills rail cars by the thousands. Beneath Saskatchewan lies the world's largest potash reserves, a mineral essential to modern fertilizer. Without potash, global crop yields collapse. Nearly half the world's population depends on fertilizer that relies on potash inputs. Canada produces about 32% of the global supply, controls roughly 41% of exports, and still has an estimated 1.1 billion tons underground. On top of that, Canada exports around 27.7 million tons of wheat annually to more than 80 countries, generating about $11.5 billion a year. Add canola, barley, oats, lentils, peas, and specialty crops, and Canada becomes one of the most influential agricultural producers on Earth. By 2023, total agricultural exports exceeded $99 billion, with steady growth projected. Yet the system moving those products told a very different story. Most Western Canadian grain flows through Vancouver, a port plagued by congestion, labor disruptions, and rising costs. Large volumes also cross into the United States before reaching global markets. Fertilizer mined in Saskatchewan often travels on American rail lines to American ports. Every step adds fees collected by companies that do not grow crops or mine fertilizer but profit from controlling the routes. For years, this setup was seen as inefficient but unavoidable. Vancouver was the only major Canadian port with year-round Pacific access. Eastern routes through the St. Lawrence added weeks to shipping times. Northern alternatives existed on paper, not in practice. Dependence on U.S. infrastructure slowly became habit, and habit became assumption. That assumption cracked when politics entered the equation. Trump's tariff threats turned logistical dependence into strategic vulnerability. Prairie farmers suddenly realized that decisions made in Washington could disrupt their livelihoods because Canada did not fully control how its goods reached the world. The issue was no longer cost efficiency. It was sovereignty over trade. The solution had been sitting on Canada's northern edge for nearly a century. The port of Churchill, built in the 1930s, was designed as a gateway to Europe through Hudson Bay. It offered a route thousands of kilometers shorter than paths through Vancouver or U.S. ports. Rail-connected and deep water capable, it should have been transformative. Instead, it was neglected. Underfunding limited its season. Traffic stayed low. In 1997, the federal government sold the port and its 1,300-kilometer rail line to an American company, Omnitrax, for $1. Investment never followed. When flooding damaged the rail line in 2017, the company walked away, cutting Churchill off entirely. In 2018, a consortium of 41 First Nations communities and northern Manitoba towns bought the port and railway, forming the Arctic Gateway Group. At the time, most observers saw it as symbolic rather than practical. Indigenous ownership carried meaning, but few believed Churchill would become commercially important again. That skepticism faded as global conditions changed. Shipping costs rose. Vancouver congestion worsened. U.S. trade policy became unpredictable. Climate change extended the Hudson Bay shipping season. Suddenly, Churchill made economic sense. The real turning point came in March 2025. Genesis Fertilizers, a Saskatchewan-based company planning a large nitrogen fertilizer plant, announced a partnership with Arctic Gateway Group. The plan was simple and strategic. Fertilizer inputs would be imported through Churchill. Finished products would be exported the same way. American infrastructure would be bypassed entirely. Genesis projected annual production of 1 million tons of fertilizer, including roughly 300,000 tons of imported phosphate. Historically, those materials moved through the United States. Under the new model, they would not. The route through Hudson Bay connects directly to Atlantic shipping lanes, cutting distance, cost, and political risk. This was not a patriotic gesture. It was a business decision. Once fertilizer moved north, the logic spread. Saskatchewan's fertilizer industry alone is worth billions. If one company could restructure supply chains around Churchill, others could follow. Grain offered an even larger opportunity. Canada exports nearly 29 million tons of grain annually through Vancouver. Churchill historically handled only a fraction of that, not because of demand, but because of limited infrastructure. Arctic Gateway Group's strategy was not to replace Vancouver overnight, but to unlock capacity that simply did not exist before. The Port of Churchill Plus project aims to do exactly that. Plans include upgraded grain handling equipment, expanded storage, modern loading systems, and increased rail capacity. Icebreaker support could extend the shipping season from a few months to nearly year-round operations. With those upgrades, Churchill becomes a reliable export hub. The route to Europe through Hudson Bay cuts roughly 6 days off shipping time compared to Vancouver. For buyers and traders, that translates directly into lower costs and better market timing. More importantly, it keeps Canadian exports entirely within Canadian control. This is where the $780 billion figure comes from. It does not mean Canada's entire agricultural sector shifts north, nor does it eliminate existing routes. It reflects the projected value of trade that could logically flow through Arctic infrastructure over a decade. Potash exports alone are worth about $5.5 billion annually. Redirecting even half of that volume north over 10 years equals roughly $27.5 billion. Add grain exports to Europe and parts of Asia, fertilizer imports and exports previously routed through the U.S., potential critical mineral shipments, and possible energy flows if Alberta's proposed corridor advances, and the numbers grow quickly. Spread over 10 years with modest growth, the total approaches $700 to $800 billion. The United States will not lose all of that activity, but American ports, railways, and logistics firms stand to lose a meaningful share of business they have controlled for generations. What makes this shift powerful is its permanence. Infrastructure shapes behavior for decades. Once supply chains are built around Churchill, they do not reverse easily. A fertilizer plant designed for Arctic logistics does not switch routes because of a temporary policy change. Grain elevators built for northern exports will serve that purpose for generations. There are real challenges. Churchill's rail line crosses unstable permafrost. Maintenance is costly. The port needs hundreds of millions in upgrades. Icebreaker capacity remains limited. Labor and housing shortages complicate expansion. Skepticism remains after decades of failed promises. But this moment is different because incentives finally align. Shipping costs elsewhere are rising. Arctic seasons are lengthening. Private companies are committing capital. Provinces are backing the strategy. The federal government under Mark Carney has pledged $180 million over 5 years, enough to signal national priority. If even part of this plan succeeds, Churchill becomes one of Canada's most strategic ports within a decade. And as that happens, hundreds of billions in agricultural trade begin moving along routes American companies do not control. At its core, this shift is about leverage. Trade that depends on foreign infrastructure gives power away. Trade that flows through domestic systems builds independence. Canada always had the resources. Political pressure simply forced the country to finally use them. The port once dismissed as outdated is now quietly reshaping North American trade, and the change is already too far along to turn back. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next upload. See you in the next one.